Luther arrived in Worms on August 16, 1521, where the imperial diet under Charles V was conducting the business of the empire. 2 days later, on the 18th of April, Luther took his famous stand, not in the St. Peter's Cathedral, but behind it in the bishop's palace in the Heilshof Garden. He had already been excommunicated from the Catholic Church 4 months before, so it was time to appear before the Holy Roman Empire, before the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. There was no need for further disputations or argument. There was only one question that the Reich posed: will or will you not take back, revoke, recant what you have written? Many of the characteristics that have been associated with the name Luther are brought out in this superb performance of Luther in 1953. There are a number of characteristics that you may have seen that we tend to associate with this moment in history. Steadfastness, I'll also give the German as I'm going along, Standhaftigkeit, intemperance, Ausschweifung, infuriation, Verärgerung, defiance, Trotz, and a grain of uncertainty, Unsicherheit. There was conviction, Überzeugung, and resolve, Entschlossenheit, but not without a degree of apprehension, Befürchtung. Central to his stand was what his conscience was telling him to do, but there we have to be a bit careful, because the conscience that Luther had a lot to do with his knowledge of what was right. His conscience, as you heard, was captive. It was part of the Bible. After the Enlightenment, about the 18th century, we tend to associate conscience with an individual sense of good, bad, right, and wrong, depending on how we individually feel about that. Not long after what was the most difficult year of his life, 1527, he wrote the famous hymn of the Reformation, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Since that hymn will appear at different times throughout tonight's presentation, I underscore just two of its verses, both of which are found in the first stanza. They are, "A mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing, a defensive wall never failing, and for still our ancient foe doth seek to work us woe." That foe for the historical Luther was Satan, the devil, of which Heiko Obermann gave us an unforgettable account in his widely read book, Luther, Man Between God and Devil. In 1817, Johann Wolfgang Goethe, the German Shakespeare, had been observing preparations for this great anniversary of the Reformation. And in late September, he remarked, "The Reformation is to be glorified by hundreds of writings. Between us, there is nothing interesting in the entire matter except Luther's character, which is the only thing that really impresses the crowd. All the rest is confused balderdash, which continues to burden us on a daily basis." The younger generation felt quite differently. For them, Luther meant freedom, not spiritual freedom, but political freedom. And in mid-October, students from the German universities marched to the Wartburg Castle to commemorate both the defeat of Napoleon, the Battle of Leipzig 4 years before, and the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. All members of these newly founded university fraternities, they were called Burschenschaften, throughout Germany were represented. The aims of this German Youth Association were spelled out in the Wartburg Rally Declarations, which called for, quote, national unity, constitutional freedom, a liberal all-German government, and the elimination of the vestiges of feudalism. That is, a new call for economic reforms and the elimination of monarchical rule. Luther's translation of the New Testament, which he completed at the Wartburg fortress, became a symbol of liberation, and the Wartburg itself a symbol of German nationalism. In the Knights Hall of the Wartburg fortress, Luther was praised as a freedom fighter. Because he had become so well known among Germans, his name could be the way to united Germany. Each member of the organization identified personally with the national cause. Political revolution was clearly on the horizon. The organization's mission was made graphically clear. This comes from the Declaration. The cause of German unity must be advanced through direct action and, where necessary, through violence and tyrannicide. For that reason, the German states were impelled to control the movement. The Marburg Festival, this moment, opened with a worship service patterned on the Lutheran, Christian, Catholic liturgies, and with the singing of a hymn around a fire, namely Luther's "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And then came more songs and more patriotic sermons, and the service ended with a prayer of thanksgiving. Later that evening, a book burning took place in memory of Luther's burning of the proclamation, the papal bull, that had threatened him with excommunication. Now, the books that the students burned were declared un-German, such as Saul Asher's pamphlet, Germanomania. Asher was a Jewish publicist who had argued publicly against the extremes of anti-Semitism. He denied that Germany possessed or should even seek to attain what the Romantic nationalists were after, namely an original state, or one could say a primal state, an original folk, and an original language. Surprisingly, another book was burned. At least for me, it's surprising because I think that it really kind of complements, in a way, what was happening here with respect to Luther as a national hero. That book was a play by Zacharias Wellner, and it's titled Martin Luther, or The Consecration of Power. It is by far the most successful of any drama written by a German Romantic writer. So I decided to take a look at it again. And lo and behold, what I discovered on the inside cover, there is a vignette of Luther and his wife holding hands with the caption, "Eine feste Burg ist unser Gott." A mighty fortress is our God. So why burn the book? Werner had converted to Catholicism, and he'd become a Catholic priest. In short, he had betrayed Luther. One of the most famous images in German history is Germania, the symbol of German freedom. A female who is adorned in imperial attire, and in her right hand she holds the sword, and in her left the staff of the German flag. The original painting is by Philipp Veit, and there's a question about whether or not Veit, whose Germania looks quite a bit different, was actually the painter of this. It is likely that that's not the case, that several others came together. This appeared in 1848, at the time of the revolution in Germany. Veit was the son of Dorothea Schlegel, the famous Romantic writer, and the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn. Notice that the sword of the empire, or the state, is held upright. It's in a defensive position. It is not in a position of attacking, of offense. And it was also a symbol of Germanness. In 1832, the renowned historian Leopold von Ranke asked, "Who will be able to grasp in a word or a concept what is German? Who will call it by name, the genius of our country, of the past, and of the future?" But he concluded by saying that to do so would be another phantom to lure us on yet another false road. Of course, that would depend on the beauty, the power of Germania. Heinrich Heine, the famous Jewish German writer, added satirically, where does the German begin? Where does it end? May a German smoke? Majority says no. May a German wear gloves? Yes, but only a buffalo hide. But a German may drink beer. Indeed, as the true son of Germania, he should drink beer. While away on business, Luther wrote a note to his wife, Katharina von Bora. To my dearly beloved Katie, Mrs. Dr. Luther, I eat like a Bohemian, and I drink like a German. Thanks be to God. Amen. I mentioned the Luther beer up here. A friend of mine and I can remember when we first had a Luther beer. Yes, it's Terry. And we weren't far from the city church. It's around the corner, actually, so at least it was around the corner. And we were able to handle, I don't know, 1 or 2 such beers. I must say the Luther beer is outstanding if you want to try it. Interestingly enough, there's also a Katharina von Bora beer, of which there's a bottle here. And it is also very, very good. So I can recommend both of them if you find it. It's hard to find. You can find it in Wittenberg. You can find it at some of the fall festivals, at the Christmas markets. But it's located, I mean, they have tight reins on the circulation of Luther beer. But if you're again in Wittenberg, please do order one up. I promise you a great experience. In 1848, representatives from 100 locations in the German provinces and cities gathered at Paul's Church in Frankfurt to draft a constitution for a free and unified Germany. German flags were placed over the podium, and a banner of Germania hung high, blocking a view of the church organ. While working out a constitution for the German provinces, the assembly looked to Prussia to be what they thought was the natural leader of the nation. The constitution that the National Assembly had drafted called for a federal union headed by a hereditary emperor with powers limited by a popularly elected legislature. The Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, found it too restrictive and rejected the idea of political consolidation under a liberal constitution. The revolution had failed. Nevertheless, the very existence of a National Assembly prefigured what would happen. In 1871, Germany became Germany, that is, a unified nation state made possible now not by revolution, but by reform. The date is interesting. The United States became a nation state 100 years before Germany did, although Germany clearly has a 2,000-year tradition. Now, to be sure, not everybody got caught up in the enthusiasm for nationalism. In the light of social turmoil, a different artist by the name of Alfred Wright associated revolution with the dance of death. While those illustrations of the Totes Tänze have been discussed at some length, other images by Reutel have not. And the ones to which I refer are especially interesting. He was hoping to put together 4 woodcuts. He finished 3 of them. This is one of them. And his theme for the collection was a Lutherlied, a mighty fortress is our God. In this image, Reutel pictures soldiers of God. Let me give you a little graphic here. Soldiers of God who are fighting, right, against some powers of evil. What this turns out to be is that each of these individuals here are men who represent a particular social class in Germany. Right here is not so much a table as it really is a wall. So what they are trying to do is they are trying to tempt the forces of good with material things. And what happens is that the forces of good are just too strong, and they chase away Death over here. You see him playing his little fiddle, and the devil jumps back into his den of iniquity. It is counter-revolutionary. In this image, pleasures and treasures of the world are offered also in order to entice and, for them, hopefully, defeat the forces of good. There is a tie here to the third stanza of the battle hymn of the Reformation, A Mighty Fortress, and it reads as follows. And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure, and one little word shall fell him. In the political context of Rethel's day, revolution is that foe that the devil incites. There is a third level to depictions of Martin Luther in the mid-19th century. This is a painting by Gustav König. Those of you who know German know that König is a king. So his nickname was the Lutherkönig, or the Luther King. What we have here is very, very clear. This is Luther domesticated. This is Luther at home with his family, with his children. It's a tremendous environment of peace, right? Cooperation. Yet marriage becomes the core of political cohesion. Now, this is all the same time. Revolution, counter-revolution, domestication of Luther happening all around 1850 to 1860. Luther's act of marrying, of all things, a nun, drew attention to family life, not only in their case as really one of the first, not the first, but one of the first parsonages, but it certainly became a model for the middle class. The middle class at that time was very well deep-seated in the cultural. It was a strong educational class, and they felt that this model of marriage was really important to bind together German society. And ever since then, as you know, the parsonage has played an enormous role in the intellectual history of Germany, really to this day, as we'll see at the end of the presentation. Now, what you see in this illustration is pretty typical, patriarchal, you know, the woman to your side helping out. The reality, however, is quite different when you talk about Luther and his wife, Katharina von Bora. Katharina was not a meek and mild and completely obedient helpmeet. She was a strong-minded individual who knew her business, and quite literally, through her efforts, she made Luther the second wealthiest person in Wittenberg. Significantly, they were really equal partners in marriage. I think it's well worth, if you haven't done so, getting acquainted with the woman reformer, Katharina von Bora. She had what Luther had, character. And if you would like to have an interesting introduction to her, we have one here, a book by Ruth Tucker on Käthe Luther, First Lady of the Reformation, The Unconventional Life of Katharina von Bora, that appeared just this year, just a couple of months ago. As we move to the 20th century, following World War I, in the first years of the Weimar Republic, Hitler and other National Socialists staged riots in the streets of Munich. Their racism was broadcast early and loudly. One of the most talented speakers of the time was Hans Schemm. I will mention, as parenthetically, that Hitler, that's an interesting slip, as we'll see in a minute. Hitler was an outstanding orator, as you know. And people say, well, why is that? Well, it's because he spent literally hours and days practicing, rehearsing his speeches in front of a full-length mirror. Every aspect, every gesture, every look, every nod was worked out in advance for the highest possible effect on the people in terms of what he was trying to convey to them. Joseph Goebbels was also very adept. He followed a very similar type of training when addressing the people. Hans Schemm, very interesting individual. He belonged to the Freikorps of Bayreuth. He was a Gauleiter, that is the head of a district under Nazi rule. He was very adept at building parts of the infrastructure of Nazi Germany. He became party leader for Bavaria and editor of several Nazi papers. Now, for those teachers among us, hang on to your seat. He also founded and led the National-Socialist Teachers Federation and edited their newspaper, the National-Socialist Teachers Magazine. Let's listen in on one of his speeches.
The past belongs to a great historical whole that is now completed. Today something entirely new is beginning. Today marks a new era after 2,000 years. For the first time since German history began to be written, since people fought and sacrificed, bled and prayed, laughed and wept, the German people stands racially aware and united as an acting, living thing. Therefore, we live in the greatest age of German history, since the individual and the people, as well as politicians and the government, have become aware of the greatest value of the German people, race. We therefore stand at the threshold of the greatest spiritual, cultural, and political development of our people. The German people is building its government through National Socialism on the eternal foundation of its race. For the first time in millennia, German blood and German soul are coming into their own. We know that there is a blood that is not material, but yet has within itself the very essence of life. That is spiritual life, the blood of the German people that has flowed through the German people for centuries and millennia, expressing the longing of the German in spiritual and philosophical ways, like that of Faust, which always come to expression. Today's battle is a battle of the German. That also explains the spiritual nature of today's wonderful struggles. We see ourselves as a people, as a highly organized organism. Germandom abroad will die and lose its meaning if it does not maintain a living connection to the deepest intellectual, spiritual, and blood life of the motherland and people, even to the last German abroad. The people is a powerful spiritual force on this planet that never rests, but rather always wants to become stronger. It is the highest entity striving toward God. We must therefore become accustomed to using the word people with the same reverence and respect that we give to the concepts of God and religion.
The police files on Schemm report that after almost every speech that he made, they would sing, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." What was the foe in that hymn? The Jew. 1933 was a fateful year for Germany. Otto Dibelius, a Protestant bishop, preached at Hitler's inauguration, boldly saying, "I have always considered myself an anti-Semite. One cannot ignore that Jewry has played a leading role in all the destructive manifestations of modern civilization." The violence in word and in deed continued. That year, hundreds of Jews were murdered, Jewish businesses were boycotted, and Jews were expelled from all public offices, according to what was called the Aryan Paragraph. In spite of repeated overtures, the Protestant Church Committee could not be convinced to speak out openly against the new Nationalist Socialist state. The 450th anniversary of the birth of Martin Luther took place just 10 months after Adolf Hitler seized power. One of the images of its commemoration was this bulletin. In German it reads, "Hitlers Kampf und Luthers Wehr, des deutschen Volkes gute Wehr." I'd like you to listen to a line from "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" in German, because it rhymes there. "Eine feste Burg ist unser Gott, eine gute Wehr und Waffen. In English it reads, Hitler's battle and Luther's teachings, a mighty bulwark of the German folk. In National-Socialist Germany, Protestant Christians were divided among themselves. There were three factions. The German Christians, the confessing Germans of what were called the Confessing Church, and another group without title. I'll simply refer to it as the third faction. This is the original flag. There were several other editions of the flag of the German Christians. As you can see, a swastika is superimposed over the cross. The D on the left is Deutsche. The C on the right is Christen, German Christians. Those of you who are familiar a little bit with the iconography of the 16th century might be reminded of something. Hans Luft, one of the publishers in Wittenberg, published an illustration of a cross with Christ hanging on, and on the left-hand side was Frederick the Wise, who was the benefactor, the protector of Luther in Saxony, and on the right-hand side was Martin Luther, both of them looking across from each other and looking clearly at the cross. At least that's what I'm remembering about that particular part. This, for any Christian, is blasphemy. I'll be honest with you, it's an insult to any Christian who believes in the need for love and for forgiveness. But there's something worse and more ominous. 3 years before Martin Luther died, he wrote an invective against the Jews. It's called Concerning the Jews and Their Lies. It is one of the most vile and violent texts of the Reformation. We need only cite a few lines from that long treatise, if you will, to see how it could be appropriated by the Nazis. Upon cursing the Jews, Luther calls for action. Quote, first, set ablaze the synagogues and schools, and what does not disintegrate completely, cover up with dirt so that no one can see a single stone or a single cinder. This is what one should do with honor for our Lord and Christendom, so that God may see that we Christians neither tolerate nor approve of such public lies, curses, and blasphemy of his Son and his Christian followers. God is so angry with them that they must be gotten rid of. Next to the devil, a Christian could have no more poisonous and bitter enemy than a Jew. One of the most active German Christians was Wolf Meyer Erlach, who wrote that Luther was the most outrageous fighter which the world has ever seen, who, along with another great fighter, Adolf Hitler, belong, quote, together for all time. Scholars have had a difficult time coming to terms with this writing. In particular, let me give you a couple of explanations. I understand each one of them, but I'd also like to draw out a point here that maybe we haven't thought enough about. I can argue, as scholars have, that there's 400 years that separates the Reformation from National-Socialist Germany. Therefore, Luther cannot be held responsible for the genocide, mass murder of Jews after 38 approximately. Second argument. Well, we have to understand that at the time of the Reformation, we're dealing with a religious issue, and that this particular saying by Luther certainly went over the top. Somehow, it's understandable given the anti-Semitism of the 16th century. In its historical context, Luther suffered from numerous illnesses, including gall and kidney stones, severe constipation, at times deep depression, and it had worn him down. He could not understand why the Jews had not accepted the gospel of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and he let his anger fly. For him and for other reformers, there was an urgency. They believed that the end of time was near. It was an apocalyptic world in which he lived. The Turks were advancing on the Eastern Front. The Ottoman Kingdom, Ottoman Empire, was threatening the Reich, knocking on the door of Vienna. The Spanish were invading from the left, the French from the left. It was a very chaotic time. And so not only he, but also Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli looked at their own time as an apocalyptic age. So some people then refer to this as clearly some aspect of the anti-Semitic problems associated with Luther. The superintendent of the German Christian press at the time, Heinz Dunks, who published and edited numerous of these kinds of writings, such as Martin Luther on the Jews, Away with Them, by the Lutheran bishop Martin Sasse. If you take a look at Sasse's text, oh, is that me? I hope not. Maybe it's a little bit hot. Okay. Can you still hear me in the back there? All right. I'm getting a little bit of interference. Thank you, Jesse. And in this book, it seems that he celebrates the Kristallnacht. He says, on November the 10th, 1938, November the 10th, 38, Luther's birthday, the synagogues in Germany are burning. An English translation of the work appeared simultaneously. But that very sentence that I just read is missing from the English version, and the English translation bears a different title. It simply says, Martin Luther and the Jews. For the German Christians, the name Luther carried significantly more than symbolic significance. The German Christian support for the regime was opposed by the confessing Christians, who, like Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, strove to distance themselves from both the German Christians and Luther's racial anti-Semitism. But as valiant as many of the confessing Christians were, their opposition could not counteract the influence of the German Christian organization. Martin Niemöller addressed the consequences of acquiescing and turning one's back on the truth in a now famous poem of protest titled, First They Came. It reads, First they came to the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. The third and the largest faction of Protestant Christians during National Socialism did not go by any particular name. Generally, they took a middle position, although there's quite a difference in understanding here, as I'll point it out in just a moment. I'll take the example of Pastor Walter Holsten in Moringen, who referred to the prisoners in what were called protective custody camps. And he said that what they needed was preaching and pastoral care that were based in God. Well, so far, However, they would need to impart the right internal position toward folk and state. In his book, Demonizing the Jews, Luther and the Protestant Church in Nazi Germany, Christopher Probst summarizes Holsten's attitude. Ultimately, Holsten argues for a muted Christian witness to Jews with low expectations of its effectiveness, coupled with Christian support for government-sanctioned restrictions of Jewish liberty and civil liberty. One of the most interesting cases, though, of the third faction Christians is that of Heinrich Hamelink. He was the son of Protestant missionaries to India who became professor of church history at the university in Marburg. Probst suggests that Hamelink's knowledge of how people lived in nations and cultures outside of Germany extended to his own work in the ecumenical movement of the time. Probst. Hamelink clearly is ill at ease with folkish Christianity. Also present are a consistently expressed rejection of irrational, nationalistic, anti-Semitic argumentation and a complete lack of xenophobic assertions against Jews, both of which were highly unusual for a Protestant theologian in Nazi Germany. Probably the last most devastating act when Hitler refused to surrender, several air forces went in and totally destroyed the city of Dresden. This here is the Church of Our Lady, where several of us a couple of years ago attended an organ concert. This is what it looked like at the time. You're also going to notice something else. It's a monument. Came crashing down. What is it? Martin Luther. At that time, as you know, it took a couple of years for two parts of Germany to become recognized as independent yet somehow related German states. The East German government of the German Democratic Republic, and of course West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. Both began in 1949 when I was born. It's easy to remember this history, especially in my classes, because I can relate to it very, very well. And in 1961, East Germany built, I think within a week, or was it just 2 days, a wall, heavily fortified, between East and West Berlin. This was in mid-August 1961. I'd like to show you something that is really fascinating. It's a picture of Martin Luther King, together with Father Abernathy, at the wall in Berlin, 1964. You may recall that Michael, Lutheran King's father, went to Berlin in 1934, exactly 30 years before, to attend a World Baptist Convention. He was so taken by Martin Luther that he decided to change his own name to Martin Luther King. When Michael came along, he was again so entranced by Luther that he wanted to share, let's say, the enthusiasm he had for Protestantism, especially for the recognition of the importance of faith and Scripture and salvation and all those things that Martin Luther understood. And so he named his son Martin Luther King Jr. That picture blows me away. There's that highly fortified wall. As you know, there were soldiers stationed along the way. Many people lost their lives, assuming they could get over the barbed wire. They wouldn't have a chance getting over the wall. And wow, what an interconnection. There is Martin Luther Jr., King Jr., standing more or less where his father were under not completely total, but nearly total situation. How quickly time passes, how short historical changes occur, how quickly things get out of control and things become violent and problematic, and they lead to all sorts of different things. When the Luther sites of central Germany celebrated the last Reformation anniversary in 1967, the event took place during an ice age in the relationship between the state and the church in the German Democratic Republic. This became clear through a very interesting attempt to secularize the Reformation under the concept of an early bourgeois revolution, as Friedrich Engels had mentioned in his book on the Great German Peasant Revolt. It was made even more concrete through the deliberate marginalization of events organized by the church, for example, by scheduling celebrations of the Russian October Revolution of 1917 at exactly the same time. A central church event in Wittenberg on October 31st, 67, was held primarily in order to keep up the pretense of an all-German evangelical church. By the early 1980s, things had changed dramatically. The General Secretary of the Socialist Unity Party, Erich Honecker, declared that, quote, the GDR is the outcome of centuries of struggle by all the progressive forces of the German people for social progress. Everything progressive and all who have contributed to it, including Martin Luther, are indispensable parts of the traditions of the national identity of East Germany. The state was no longer an ideological construct. It represented a national identity, now claiming its own historical inheritance. Since only 5% of East Germany's citizens were Catholic, Luther's potential as a unitive rather than a divisive symbol was highlighted. In 1983, the JDR used the occasion of the 5th centenary of Luther's birth for an intense ideological offensive to try to win recognition and respect, especially from scholarly and intellectual circles in the West. This time, however, unlike in 1967, even Karl Marx's anniversary could not compete with Luther. Marx was overshadowed by the 500th anniversary of the birth of the religious reformer. The writing that brought about the change was written by Gerhard Brentler, in English, Martin Luther, Theology and Revolution, a Marxist account. We know that in 1989, we experienced the fall of the wall. One of the reasons for this had to do with Monday night prayer vigils, which in Leipzig, not the only place, but in Leipzig, were held in the Nikolai Church. It was a motivating factor in the eventual fall of the wall, although there were not only Christians that were there praying. There were non-religious activists, and there were any number of Stasi spies. However, the time was ripe. You'll recall that East Germany was economically bust. It had the shoulders of the economy of Eastern Europe as well as Russia on its back, and it simply could not sustain itself anymore. Interesting, we have nonviolent protestations, nonviolent demonstrations. We have the fall of the wall, a revolutionary act without violence. That's the reality of 1989. Is it the only one in German history? Possibly. Again, if you want to touch history, you want to have part of the wall in your hand, we have a piece of it right there. Feel free to touch it because you'll be touching the past. It's 1989. I wish I had my Luther Bible here. I have a 100-year centenary copy, quite a rare book, Nuremberg Bible of the original Luther's Bible. As you may recall, when Luther translated the Bible, clearly he's still Catholic. I mean, the Reformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens over maybe 10 years. It took him 10 years to finally take off his Catholic habit. But in addition to that, he translated the apocryphal writings. So when you look at the original translation, it has the Old Testament, the apocryphal writings, and the New Testament as well. Okay? I wish I could have that here, but see, I'm getting older and I'm in this thing like my wife and what are we going to give the kids? Okay, I think I'll give my son Eric, who is a pastor, my 1644 precious Bible. It's fantastic if you've taken a look at any of these Bibles. They have woodcuts. They have leaves that come out with remarkable drawings and illustrations, cross-references, you name it. It's just fun, just going through the Bible and appreciating really how much art was associated with that as well. We'll move to Luther today. Today, the Reformation is being commemorated on 100 locations and 1,000 events that mark the 500th anniversary of Luther's 95 Theses on Indulgences in Germany alone. One of the most important exhibits on the Reformation in Germany is the one on Luther and National Socialism at the German Museum in Berlin. It is an exhibition of the foundation for the topography of terror and memorial of German resistance, and it is titled Überall Luthers Worte, Martin Luther im Nationalsozialismus. Luther's words are everywhere, Martin Luther in National Socialism. These are the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who spoke them at the November 10th, 1933 Luther Day. What do you see on the panel? Eine feste Burg ist unser Gott. A second important exhibition on Luther is called the Luther Effect, Protestantism, 500 years in the world, which charts the spread of Protestant Christianity worldwide. It addresses both the positive effects and the counter effects of Protestantism on the examples of Sweden, the United States, Korea, and Tanzania. By the way, the second largest Protestant Lutheran church today is in the Congo. I have that book. I ordered it. It came not too long ago here, so there is the English edition of that exhibit here. I understand that my colleague Barbara Costa has seen that one. I don't know if you saw the one sort of next door, Luther and National Socialism. Professor Lutz Heumann, who is the current director of the Center for Late Medieval and Reformation Studies, is here with us this evening. I recall a dinner that we went to 2 weeks ago. It was at the annual conference of the German Studies Association, and we were sitting at the same table, and we had the good fortune of listening to one of the most outstanding Luther scholars ever, Helmut, right? Lehnart. And if you recall, I was kind of mesmerized, and I also, it just is incredible. He called this exhibit of Luther and National Socialism the most important exhibit in the 500th anniversary year of the beginning of the Reformation. By the way, this exhibit you still have time to see. That is, let me go on a little bit here. That is the one on the Luther Effect. The Luther Effect closes on November the 5th. So if you're interested in maybe getting a flight out of town to Berlin, you can still take that one in, which Lehman calls the most important exhibition of this year. We're going to wrap it up here in a moment, almost finished. I wanted, however, to share with you a few things about our 21st century. This is a picture of Luther and Angela Merkel by Miles Donovan that came out this year. This month, as you know, the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Angela Merkel, was re-elected to serve an unprecedented 4th term. Merkel is a PK. She's a pastor's kid. Sometimes we call it a TO, a theologian's offspring. She's the daughter of an East German Lutheran pastor and herself a practicing Lutheran Christian. It's interesting, that heritage, but I wondered to myself, I thought, well, that's interesting, but somehow that must be also reflected in her language. And I was looking at some speeches and that type of thing, and I, was finding it. Then I decided, well, what about when she announced her candidacy? And so I'm going to play for you just a 2-minute clip, which is an interview where she announced that she would run for a 4th term as Chancellor of Germany. And let's see if you can hear Luther in there. Joachim Gauck was the president of Germany. He just stepped down this last February 2017. Joachim Gauck was an East German Lutheran minister who served in the resistance against East German regime. As has been customary, the departure of the President of the Federal Republic is honored essentially with military honors, a large ceremony, lots of pomp and circumstance, and it seems that it was the music that moved him the most. The President has his residence at the Bellevue in Berlin, also one in Bonn, that's the Hammerschmidt. I had the great privilege of being greeted by Richard von Weizsäcker, who was then president, when I received the fellowship from the Alexander Humboldt Foundation. It was a tremendous honor, as it is this week, 500th anniversary of Luther, to be able to speak not once but twice, also next week. I really appreciate your attention. I'd just like to add 1 or 2 notes, if I may. The words and the sounds of Luther are heard everywhere. 1 week from tonight, 1 week from today, is October 31st. It is on that day that I believe Martin Luther indeed posted his 95 Theses on the efficacy of the indulgences on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. I believe there are good reasons for that. I believe that Heiko Obermann is right. Heiko Obermann first argued with Erwin Iserloh in 1961, who was a West German professor. I've studied the literature, the scholarship. I find most of it unconvincing. And I'm hoping that if we have an opportunity next Tuesday, that Ute and I might be able to kick that around a little bit. Be careful with mythbusters. Mythbusters, that's fine, but sometimes they lack adequate historical knowledge. So just think about that, what that be. My question too is Luther relevant? I would hope that one of the aspects of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation will be to remind us of the problem of violence. The violence in language, the violence in action. That, I hope, is something that we can say is really a relevant topic today as we think about the importance not only of Martin Luther, but as the beginning of what is one of the greatest, has had the greatest influence, perhaps the greatest influence, on our Western tradition. I thank you very much for your attention, and am happy to take a question or two, whatever you'd like. So please, go right ahead. And by the way, do we have a...